Hey Megan, how are you doing?
I'm all right. I'm in beautiful sunny Pasadena, where things seem to be going pretty well. How about yourself?
I'm in not so sunny Miami in a kind of grim hotel room starting my book tour, but other than that, things are going well.
Really? I thought it was always sunny in Miami.
It's a little overcast. I can't complain.
Go ahead.
You want to do little introductions?
Absolutely. My name's Megan McArdle, and I'm a writer for The Atlantic, where I also blog at meganmcardle.theatlantic.com. I mostly write about economics and public policy.
And my name is Glenn Greenwald. I write for Salon.com, where I'm a contributing writer, and I also write a blog there that focuses on political, media, and legal issues called Unclaimed Territory.
Well, I guess we should jump right into it. The topic of the day is the media and how it's been covering the war on terror. Maybe you could start with a summary of your position.
Yeah, I had written a post. I guess you and I had a fairly spirited exchange over the last week that has led us here. And the way that started was I had written a post about a week ago focusing on the media's fixation on what I consider to be, and what I would hope everyone would consider to be, very sort of petty and inconsequential matters, such as Barack Obama and his bowling score and what that signifies about his character. The ongoing obsession with the video of his pastor, Reverend Wright, even things like Clinton and Lewinsky and where she was on the day that Monica Lewinsky had sex with Bill Clinton, things like that have gotten intensive coverage over the past 30 days, while far more weightier matters, including new revelations, have received almost no attention, such as the endorsement of torture by the Bush administration as embodied by the John Yoo memo, the suspension of the Fourth Amendment, which that memorandum identified, something that we learned about for the first time, the suspension of the Fourth Amendment inside the United States, as well as the speech that the Attorney General gave about 2 weeks ago, where he just invented, or seemed to have invented, a brand new claim about how the 9/11 attacks happened that no one, including the 9/11 Commission or the Congress, had ever heard about before, and those matters were essentially, relatively speaking, almost entirely ignored. And I did some Nexus searches to show the comparative attention that they were getting and drew some conclusions about the media and how they behave that you disagreed with, and I'll leave it to you to outline your views and why you disagreed.
Well, I think what we disagree... Well, there are two sources of disagreement. I mean, I think, first of all, you had said that this was a result of the fact that the media class is sort of insulated from its readership and concerned with trivia. And I think that that's a sort of normative issue that I'll get into in a minute. But I mean, to start with, I think Nexus searches are a dangerous weapon because it's always very sensitive to what you search. It's basically a dumb machine. So, for example, if I do the same Nexus search that you did, I get about 100 responses for you and torture, but I get about 1,000 responses for Bush and torture. And I think so. Part of it is, how did the papers report the issue? Did they report it as a member of the staff, or did they report John Yoo's name? That's sort of one part of this, I think. That and you also have to remember that when you do a Nexus search, you're going to pick up a lot of regional results. And so, the New York Times and the Washington Post and so forth may have done 8 stories on something, but if it's not sort of picked up by the Syracuse Post-Gazette and the Finger Lakes Times and what have you, something else will show up as having gotten a lot more coverage. And in some sense, that's true, right? The local dailies tend to focus more on sort of the humane aspects of candidacies than they do about things like national security. National security just really isn't their beat. And we could say that this is a sad change in the status of local papers, which is quite possibly true. Gone are the era when the Indianapolis papers had foreign bureaus and so forth. But in terms of how much play it gets in the media, it can be very deceptive in terms of how much information did people get, and then there's also a question of how long were the stories, right? If you get these little tiny 4-line stories on Obama's bowling score, that shows up. That may have been a cute little box in the Sunday Style section. That's going to show up as a news story. Whereas, John Yoo may have gotten 1,200 words in each paper that he ran in. So I think there's a lot of sort of questions about how much that's actually telling us about what people got. And I don't know the answer to that. I'm just saying that I think nexus searches are often a bad way to find out what people actually sort of know.
Right.
But the second question is, why does this happen? And because I do agree, certainly, that there are stories that I don't think are particularly important get coverage, and I sort of, shrug my shoulders and go, huh? I don't know that I would agree that the Reverend Wright story is one of them. I'm an Obama supporter, and I certainly, personally, am not particularly interested in that for reasons that I could go into, but I doubt you much care. I didn't think that it was a story that sort of devastated Obama's character. But that said, a lot of people clearly did, and it really clearly struck an incredible chord and became incredibly important to the campaign, and therefore was newsworthy, despite the fact that you and I might not think that this is sort of an important mirror into his character. When a lot of voters do, you kind of have to, as the media, that's an important story.
Right.
But the real thing that I was questioning is, you're making a claim about why journalists do what they do that just doesn't match with my experience of journalists.
You mean anecdotally? Or in terms of something beyond that?
I don't know how you would be non-anecdotal about something like why. I mean, you basically, there's only about 10 papers that could even sort of reasonably claim to be national papers at this point. And I know journalists from all of them who cover politics. My experience of them has nothing to do with being insulated from their readers. It's rather the reverse. They have to cover things that their readers are going to care about, even when they don't care about them. And that, you can say that this is a problem with America. I think that I'm reluctant to make that claim. I'm reluctant to say that there's a problem with America when everyone is not as fantastically interested in every topic that I think is of vital importance. And there are a lot of topics that I think are of vital importance to the world that clearly the country just doesn't care about for whatever reason, that the stories don't sell. If you look at what happens on websites, this is a case of the media following, not the media leading. If you look at what gets clicks, it isn't the John Yoo stories. Your audience is a lot smaller than, say, Gawker's, and that's, possibly, or Wonk Hats. And we can sort of mourn the fact that that's true, but it is true. And so saying that this is happening because journalists are insulated from their readers is, I think, fundamentally wrong.
All right. Well, you raised a huge number of issues there, and it probably will be more constructive if we sort of talk about them one by one. Sure. Let me just address the first thing that you said, which is the issue about the nexus searches and the data that I cited in order to demonstrate that petty stories were getting a lot more coverage than weightier ones. I don't think there's any metric that one could use that would be bestowed with scientific exactitude. I mean, it's certainly true that nexus searches in both directions can be imperfect. I mean, they could suck up stories about you and torture that actually didn't have anything to do with the revelation of that memorandum, in the same way that they can include stories about Obama and bowling that might have been small. But I did spend a substantial portion of my new book, looking at, for example, certain types of personality stories that received what Howell Raines, the former New York Times executive editor, used to call flood the zone coverage. And probably one of the most intensively covered political stories of 2007 was the story that was first broken by Ben Smith at the Politico regarding John Yoo and the haircut that he received and the amount of money that he spent. John Edwards, right. I don't think John Yoo's haircuts have been in the news, but John Edwards has. Thank you. And there, in every single one of these national newspapers that you were just referencing, and on huge numbers of television shows, it made the television debates, multiple column stories, television segments devoted to questions about John Edwards' haircut, how much money he spent on his hair. And at the end of this very intensive 3-week news cycle, there was a poll that was done by Fox News that asked voters if they could identify the candidate who was recently in the news for having spent a large amount of money on his haircut. And something like 50% of Americans, 50%, successfully identified John Yoo. By contrast...
John Edwards.
I'm sorry. Yeah, we've been talking so much about John Yoo, and John Edwards is not someone I've thought about for a long time, along with a lot of other people. So, yeah, John Edwards. So 50% could identify him as that person. By contrast, around the time that we invaded Iraq, and for 6 months after we invaded Iraq, 70% of the American public, 70, when asked, said that they believe that Saddam Hussein personally participated in the planning of the 9/11 attacks, which I think at this point everyone, even people like Bill Kristol, acknowledge is not a debatable issue. It's just a myth. It's false to think that Saddam Hussein personally participated in the 9/11 attacks. So 20% more Americans knew that John Edwards paid a lot of money for his haircut than knew, even after we invaded Iraq, that Saddam Hussein had no role to play in the 9/11 attacks. I mean, do you really dispute that the media spends way more time on kind of petty, gossipy personality issues like that? And do you actually not think of that state of affairs is very profoundly problematic?
Well, let's go back to an era when I think of the media as having been fairly saturated. Would you agree that in the sort of end of the 30s, beginning of the 40s, that the media spent a lot of time on what we call serious stories?
Yeah. I would agree with that.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing, actually, is that I can't remember where I saw it, they did a survey after Pearl Harbor, and either a majority or a close majority of Americans thought that Hitler had been involved in that. And so I think that sort of...
you mean right after the attacks, or 6 months after we were at war with Germany?
Yeah, something like 6 months after Pearl Harbor. As we got into the war, people thought that Hitler had been involved in Pearl Harbor, which we now know is not true. So I think that yes, Americans are ignorant. I'm always shocked when they run those stories about what we can't do on history and so forth. But here's the thing. Is the problem that the history teachers aren't up in front of the room giving the students the facts, or is the problem that the students aren't listening? And I would submit that it's the latter, that the students aren't paying attention. And so saying that people had crazy ideas, I don't think that anyone... There were... I may be wrong about this, you've just finished a book on it, but I was paying pretty close attention to the media in 2003, and I don't remember the New York Times running a lot of stories saying that Saddam Hussein had been behind the attacks. I don't remember that running on television either.
Well, no, but Bush officials were constantly linking them, not explicitly by coming out and saying that Saddam planned the 9/11 attacks, but constantly linking them in all sorts of statements, insinuating that the responsibility for what had happened lay with Iraq, and that a war with Iraq was about seeking retribution or going after the people who had perpetrated the 9/11 attacks. And there was virtually no effort on the part of the media. I think most journalists would agree now that there was a profound failure on the part of the media to check those government claims, to subject them to real scrutiny, to prevent the government from disseminating false or dubious claims about Iraq. And as a result, huge percentages of the population listened to those government claims with no media intervention, no watchdog role, and ended up reaching the conclusions that they reached. And I mean, I guess we're going to talk about in a moment what the duty of journalists are and why this is. But I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get a sense of is, do we at least have this minimal area of agreement that regardless of what the reasons are, regardless of whether there are solutions or what those solutions might be, that it is profoundly problematic in a democracy to have a huge portion of the population either completely ignorant about what its government is doing or actively deceived and misled about what the reality of the world is as a result of the media either not doing its job properly or the people not listening. I mean, is that a problem that you find disturbing?
I think it's disturbing that people believe things that aren't true. Yeah, I think we can agree that people shouldn't believe things that aren't true. The question is, to what extent do people believe things that aren't true because the media is, as you said, insulated and ultimately complicit with supporting the establishment because it sort of scratches their back. And I just don't think that that's a correct reading of how the media operates, why it does what it does, or what sort of change that it could have. I'm just not clear. I mean, like, one example, I was talking to a guy who's an avid reader of my blog, and one of the things that I hammer on probably once a month is the fact that the Laffer curve, not that the Laffer curve is wrong, that supply-siders were wrong and that cutting taxes during the Reagan administration and during the Bush administration did not raise tax revenues. And he was like, no. And I asked him sort of offhand, because I was in an argument with someone else, whether he thought that this was true. And he said, oh, yeah, that argument's always made a lot of sense to me, that the economy would grow and so forth. And I was like, you've been reading my blog every day for 5 years. How do you not know that I think that this is untrue? Like, he just didn't remember it. It had just sort of not hit his consciousness. And so I think that I'm just skeptical of how much of this you can lay at the door of the way the media does the coverage, and how much of it simply is the fact that now I think we can get into the fact, and something I argued on my blog is that, in fact, I think there is a problem with the way coverage happens, and I think it has to do with the way that TV does their coverage and what sort of stories run well on TV. And if a story runs well on TV, even if it's perhaps not as important as other stories, it tends to get it gets sucked into the national consciousness, and then the print media has to cover it. But even there, the TV media is following the fact. The TV media is the most responsive media to its readers,
right.
To its viewers. They are doing that because the cable news shows know exactly when people click and why. And they run the stories that will keep people on their station.
Why do you think that? I mean, why do you have so much faith in the ability of cable news executives and producers to know what their audience wants when actually their ratings are doing quite poorly? I mean, you mentioned earlier that my readership is lower than Gawker's. I'm not sure how you know that, but let's assume that's true. Daily Kos has a higher audience hit count than a lot of these cable shows that focus on the kind of trashy, vapid gossip that fills up the 24-hour cable programming. And, the media had virtually round-the-clock coverage about the Clinton sex scandals and the impeachment, and poll after poll after poll showed that Americans were really actually quite indifferent to that, and Clinton's popularity, ratings actually stayed quite high, and even increased as the coverage intensified. And so why are you so confident that whatever it is that journalists feed to their viewers is actually what those viewers want to eat? I mean, how do you know that there aren't other things?
Because they know, right? Like they can watch the readers clicking the channel when John Yoo comes on. This is not maybe.
Then why aren't they doing better? Why aren't newspapers doing better? Why are cable news programs losing audiences and having low audiences? I mean, why?
Because they have competition. I mean, the reason that all of these things are doing worse is that the market is fragmenting, and people who formerly, for example, the three networks, right? They've been losing viewer share for 20 years. It's not that they got worse. Television, I would say, has gotten better since I was a kid.
Okay, but let's talk about this issue then, because actually I think that you just put your finger on what is in reality the crux of our disagreement, the difference in the way that we see things, and everything that we've talked about so far pertains to this issue, and so let's focus on this if we can, and hopefully we'll agree that it is the key issue. For this is how I look at the discussion that we've been having, which is there are certain industries that have as their prime mandate, really their only mandate, maximizing their profits as long as they stay within the parameters of the law, right? If you own a factory and you sell widgets, or you have a store or a supermarket, or you sell clothing or whatever it is, your only concern is how to make your business as successful as possible, measured by the amount of profit that you generated. There are other businesses, though, that have profit making as one of their concerns, but not their only concern. They have other things that they have to think about that can actually conflict with the mandate to make profit, such as professions like doctors and lawyers, who have ethical obligations and duties to their clients and to the public interest that oftentimes forces them to do things that actually are contrary to the profit-making goal. I mean, lawyers can't advise their clients to go around suing everybody if it's not good for them, even if the lawyer would make a lot of money doing that. Doctors can't advise their patients to have one surgery after the next, even though that would be really good for the profit margin of the doctor, because they have other conflicting duties. I see journalism as a profession like the medical profession and the legal profession, where going into work every day and thinking about how do I maximize my profits, how do I feed my readers whatever they want so I can charge as much as I can for commercials, is not the only concern. There are other concerns that conflict with that, and I think the law gives privileges, special privileges, to journalists in every single possible realm that's based upon the assumption, the premise, that journalism owes a duty to the public interest besides just maximizing profit. I mean, do you see journalism that way? Or
well, I mean, first of all, I'm not clear on how many special privileges journalists actually have, right? Like, if we're ordered to turn over, there's a certain amount of deference that judges are reluctant to order reporters to turn over their sources and so forth, but we don't have any protection. We have no legal protection from not outing our sources. We have no legal protection that any other person doesn't have.
That's not true. First of all, the First Amendment provides constitutional protections to the defining activity of journalism. I mean, it's singled out freedom of the press, even though freedom of speech had already been protected, based on the premise that there was a reason for that, which is that journalists would play a special and important role in preserving crucial parts of our democracy. There are state laws that do have shield laws that entitle you to protect your sources. There are all kinds of government privileges, such as special guidelines for subpoenaing journalists. Journalists are given access all the time, special access that regular citizens who aren't accredited journalists can't get, to sit at the front of proceedings, to have access to proceedings. Across the board,
But that's also true of like GE's shareholder meeting. I mean, that's not a special. People give the press access because they want the press to cover whatever's going on. That's not a special right. We don't have any special legal right to get accreditation. No, they accredit us because they want to be on camera.
No, that's not true. I mean, the Supreme Court doesn't care if journalists are there or not writing about what they do. The Supreme Court realizes that it's important for the public to know what's going on in the Supreme Court, and so they give journalists special access because they assume that journalists are going to fulfill a function beyond just profit generation.
But that's an administrative
and inform
decision.
the public. Yeah, but
that's an administrative decision. There's no legal right to be an accredited Supreme Court reporter.
Some of what I identified as special privileges are legal and constitutional. Others are administrative and discretionary. Regardless, they're all special privileges that the government bestows on journalists as a class that other industries don't receive. Do you think those should all be abolished, or do you think that there is an expectation that journalists will do more than just think about how they can make as much money as possible, meaning serve the public interest by being a watchdog over the government, all the things that the founders talked about in terms of why the media was important in our democracy? I mean, do you accept that?
Well, I'd like to pull this apart actually a little bit. I mean, I do think that journalists have ethical obligations. I don't think that they're conferred by the freedom of the press and the First Amendment. I mean, any more than I think that American citizens have special obligations because we have freedom of speech. The freedom that has been given to the press is the freedom to print what they want. That's exactly that the government isn't in the job in any way of telling you what to print. That's the fundamental part of it. So no, I don't think that interacting with the state in some way conveys upon me a state-given responsibility. I deny that there is any such thing as a responsibility that can be conveyed on this.
Why did they single out that industry, the founders, when they drafted the Constitution? Why did they have a freedom to, manufacture goods that they put in the First Amendment? Why did they have a
freedom of religion? Does that mean that churches have special obligations? I mean, there's lots of freedoms in do gun manufacturers have special obligations?
No, but all of the freedoms that you're describing are freedoms that apply equally to every person by virtue of being a citizen.
So freedom of the press.
Freedom of the press is something that was directed toward the work that journalists do. It was something that, yes,
anyone can print their own magazine, and they have exactly the same protections as everyone else.
Well, if you print your own magazine, you're engaged in the work of journalism.
But that's redundant, right? Then, freedom of religion is only conferred upon people who practice religion. That's trivial. Obviously, freedom to do something is only conferred upon the people who actually want to do it. But that doesn't make being religious a special activity that then conveys some sort of special legal obligations upon you.
No, but there was a rationale as to why those rights were created, why those rights were protected, and I mean there must have been some reason why the founders thought it was important to guarantee freedom of the press. I mean, they said why, but I mean, I'm wondering what your thoughts about that are. I mean, what's the rationale?
I think it's exactly the same rationale as the rationale for freedom of speech and freedom of religion. It is the right to speak your conscience. But that doesn't mean you have to speak your conscience. It's not an obligation, it's a right.
Right,
so I think that, actually, I think we do disagree. I think that this is a right of the people to speak to each other. The state has nothing... I don't agree that there's some sort of special role created for the press and only the press by the state that then confers some sort of special obligations on us. And in fact, I don't think that doctors have special obligations because they're licensed by the state. I think they have special obligations because, they're in a certain position. And I think that journalists have special obligations too. And I think that those special obligations
What are those?
exist. I think that the special obligation... Actually, I'm not sure that they're special. I think journalists have an ethical obligation to tell the truth as best they see it. But I don't think that they have an ethical obligation as to which truths they speak.
So if the government, if the government were doing something wildly corrupt or deeply misleading, do journalists have an ethical obligation to inform the citizenry that that's taking place?
No more than any other citizen. If you know that the government is doing something wrong, you have a duty to try to stop it. But that's your duty as a citizen of the United States, not as a journalist.
No, but you were just saying that citizens don't actually have that obligation, right? I mean, you have freedom of the speech, but citizens have freedom of speech, but you're not obligated to exercise freedom of speech. There's no duty, there's no constraint that compels you to exercise that right. Do journalists have that obligation?
I think that citizens actually, if they know that something is going wrong and no one else is doing anything about it, they have an obligation to inform the public that it's happening, yes. But what constitutes informing the public, and I think that's the heart of our debate here, is when the public doesn't listen the first 7 times you've said it, do you then have an obligation to say it 20 more times on the odd chance that someone else will hear you? And there's a couple things going on here. I think this ended up getting bogged down, certainly on my blog, in a conversation about profit that to me was kind of a side point. It's important in the sense that I don't think you have an obligation to run your paper into the ground covering stories that people don't want to read, even if they're really important stories, because then there will be no paper to cover stories that people should know about. So to the extent that this actually prevents paper owners from making a profit, then yes, I would say that they don't have an obligation to do it.
Right.
The second thing, though, is that my point was not about many readers took it that way, and my commenters and many of your commenters who came over got involved in an argument about this. My point was that if people won't read the stories, they won't read the stories. If you publish stories that people don't want to read, they won't read them. And publishing more stories that people don't want to read doesn't help your cause in any way.
Well, no, it does.
If you stop buying your paper, then you've lost an ear for not only those stories but for other stories.
But I think you're ignoring one of the most critical parts of journalism that Thomas Jefferson and virtually all the founders wrote extensively about, and that history has borne out repeatedly, which is one of the things that journalists do. Good journalists who are fulfilling the mandates of their profession, not just profit generation, but actually the reason why their profession exists and why it's protected, is that they expose government deceit. They uncover government wrongdoing. They obtain evidence that can lead to the discovery of all sorts of destructive things that the government is doing that they're keeping from their people. I mean, Watergate is obviously the prime example, but the Pulitzer Prize was created in the early 20th century in order to reward exactly that kind of journalism. And if you take the position that the media doesn't have any obligations of any type to start investigating, you're essentially saying that you don't consider the media, the journalist class, a fourth estate, a watchdog over the government, and you're removing one of the central cogs that the founders envisioned for how our republic was going to function, which is fine. I mean, the founders weren't right about everything. It's certainly the fact that one disagrees with them doesn't mean that one is wrong. But it's a very radical idea to say that the media, other than sort of a vague desire to tell the truth that we all kind of have in the way that George Washington cut down the tree and had an obligation to tell the truth. Other than that sort of, kind of cliched obligation that the media has no real role to play unless they choose to play it and can make a lot of money playing it, and how our government functions and in serving as a watchdog over the government. Whether people read it or not, uncovering serious government wrongdoing can have all kinds of vital effects and has repeatedly. And I don't know. I mean, I guess if you don't think that journalists need to be doing that, then you just don't see journalism as a profession. You just see it as a business akin to having a factory. And I don't know.
No, I mean, obviously, I've chosen to be a journalist because I think that there's something special about it. But I'm certainly no constitutional scholar, so I'm perfectly open to being corrected here. But my understanding of the press in the 18th century looks nothing like journalism. The press was a guy. The newspapers were one person. These were freedoms of a citizen, and it was the freedom. And when you look at it as a freedom of a citizen, right? Does anyone who isn't a journalist have an obligation to do these same things? I don't think that there are special obligations of being a journalist to do certain things. I think there are obligations of a citizen in which journalists fully participate. I think that the obligations of journalism have to do with sort of the way that you fact check things and the way sort of canons about how you present information so that the story is, to the best of your knowledge, sort of fundamentally true. But I don't think that journalists have special obligations to say, go investigate something that normal American citizens don't. On the other hand, I think it almost doesn't matter because luckily journalists like investigating this sort of thing and they like going after those stories and their editors like having them go after those stories. So as a matter of sort of practical import, I'm not sure whether there's a moral obligation or not. But no, I don't think that journalists have special obligations apart from their incredibly profound obligations as American citizens.
Right. So let me just ask you this then, because this is something that you had mentioned on your blog, this idea that all these journalists who work for MSNBC and CNN and all these other large journalistic outlets would love so much to be engaged in this hardcore investigative journalism. Unfortunately, though, their readers don't want to hear it and their viewers don't want to listen to it, and so they're just not able to do it. And I guess what I'm wondering is, if Time Magazine tomorrow said to me, hey, we'd love for you to come and write for our magazine, and we'll quadruple what you're being paid now, and we'll give you all kinds of promotional value and get behind you that way. Unless they were willing to say to me, you can come and write about anything you want exactly the way that you want to write about it, I would never, ever do it. Why? Because I do want to do the kind of journalism that Time isn't doing. And I know that if I went and became a reporter or a pundit for Time, that I would have to talk about the kinds of things that they talk about and not the kind of things that I talk about. So why, if all of these journalists are so eager and itching to do great investigative journalism, are they working for media outlets that you yourself are saying are constrained not to do that because their readers don't want to hear it, and they're driven by that profit motive? I mean, why don't they go somewhere where they can do it if that's what they really want?
Well, I guess for the same reason that most people go to jobs that they don't particularly love. I mean, you and I are fantastically lucky. I also wouldn't go to Time Magazine because I am fortunate enough to be one of, maybe, a few thousand, a few tens of thousands of people in the United States who actually has a job just doing exactly what she wants. I write about topics that I think are incredibly important. I have immense leeway to write about them. I get to write about them at length. Most journalists don't have those jobs, and that's sort of unfortunate in the same way that it's unfortunate that most doctors don't get to have the perfect doctor job and so forth. But why do they do it? Because they need to eat. Staging a boycott of Time wouldn't change the fact that people don't want to read the stories that they write. I mean, so I guess I maybe the way to put it is this way, right? Like, you're saying that journalists have an obligation to do these things. Why don't other people have an obligation to do these things?
Well, I mean, I think the way that our form of government was set up, when in terms of not having a direct democracy but having a republic, it was based on the premise that not everybody was going to be able to closely follow what the government is doing. Most people are going to be involved in non-political functions. They were going to, work in factories. They were going to work in various professions. They weren't going to have the time and the ability to closely follow what the government was doing. And then that created the problem. Well, how are we going to ensure that the government can't systematically deceive and mislead the citizenry? And one of the checks on that sort of abuse was the fact that there would be this class of journalists who would fulfill that function, who would have the as their job serving as the watchdog over government.
But again, that's actually not that's kind of not my understanding of how journalism worked in the 18th century or what the founding fathers thought.
Well, you mean you think everybody was a journalist and writing off the printing press?
No, but they didn't think of journalists as a special class. I just don't think that was a I just don't think that people were printers. I mean, journalism wasn't even a concept back then.
Well, no, I mean,
so I don't think that you could say that they set up a special class of newspapers. Were things that printers ran off when they had free press time. Right, but there
were. I mean, Benjamin Franklin, spent a good amount of his, adult life working as what we would think of as a journalist. I mean, publishing newspapers, writing op-ed pieces, doing investigative journalism, engaging in journalistic activism to make the citizenry agitated about one thing or another. I mean, it wasn't the case that they didn't conceive at all of journalism as a profession or as a career. They talked about it as before the state.
my question is, did Ben Franklin perceive himself as being somehow like different from all the other founding fathers who weren't journalists and having special obligations? And I don't think that he did. I mean, I just don't think that you're sort of transposing a 20th century institution, the institution of being a journalist, onto an 18th century, which is much more of a sort of citizen. Ben Franklin perceived his obligations as a citizen, and not as. And in fact, the way that journalism unfolded in the 19th century doesn't match up with what you're talking about. I mean, most papers, the reason that you have things like, so many papers in small towns are called the Democrat or whatever, is that they were actually they were house organs of the political parties. This is not, I think, historically an accurate discussion of what the it might be a nice discussion of what the institution should be, but I don't think it's an accurate description of how the institution was set up or how the institution has functioned in American society for most of its history.
Well, I mean, I think, like I said, I think you can just go read the founders on that, and that would resolve the issue. And I mean, I could, post and have posted on many occasions, one quote after the next, from the founders about the vital role that journalists play. And that's not, every single citizen was going to be engaged in that function equally. It's the people who committed to doing that rather than, farming or having a medical practice or having a legal practice, who were engaged in that function. And it was expected that not every citizen would do that equally, that there would be people who would be devoted to doing it. But, I mean, I think that's really a secondary question. Is there
But I think it was also expected that not every citizen would go out and speak on soapboxes and agitate against the crown.
Well, that's
but
right.
That some of them would, right? That the freedom of speech didn't then make, when you became a speaker, create a special class of speakers who then have special obligations. I just don't think that they thought of things
Well,
that
no,
way.
there was obviously a special class of citizens called politicians who were more inclined to go and give speeches and try and rouse the citizenry than just the average citizen. I mean, if anything, the idea of having a political class versus a non-political class was much more pronounced in the colonial era and in the founding of the country, when it really was expected that the sort of decision-making power would be vested in this kind of elite, and the rest of the populace wouldn't be engaged in that function. That's why we don't have a direct democracy. And the critical question, the critical challenge was how to impose safeguards on the corruption on the part of the ruling class and the part of the political class. And to me, I guess the question that I have, and I would point to the last 7 years, beginning with the polls that I cited about people believing that Saddam Hussein was behind the 9/11 attacks and therefore supporting the government's desire to invade Iraq as Exhibit A, is if you remove the media, the role of journalism from that watchdog role and tell them, look, just go, talk about trashy gossip all the time because you're going to get a lot more ratings and you shouldn't be criticized if you do that, our country is going to suffer profoundly for it. Now, it doesn't mean that laws should be enacted to compel media corporations to cover those issues. I mean, that's a completely separate question. But whether you're going to be removing something vitally important to our country, I think is pretty self-evident. And I guess the question is, what will then be the checks on corruption on the part of the political class if the media is talking about Barack Obama's bowling score and John Edwards' haircut and Hillary Clinton's cleavage and how Obama eats chocolate? I mean, if the government then goes and...
do all journalists have this obligation? Like, do fashion journalists also have to write about political corruption?
No, I would say political journalists are the ones whose behavior we're discussing. I mean, if you go and write about architecture or art or music, obviously you have a different obligation than if you declare yourself to be a political reporter who says, we're going to be devoted to political coverage of the government. I mean, what do you consider the checks to be on government power? I mean, we have this huge federal government that operates behind a wall of secrecy. If, our media institutions aren't devoted to adversarially trying to investigate what the government's doing, subjecting their claims to critical scrutiny, I mean, who is going to do that? How is that function going to be fulfilled?
Well, I guess I'm still trying to get to who are this special class of journalists, because now it's not all journalists. Now it's political journalists. So do political journalists have a whole different set of legal protections and everything from the rest of journalists?
No, they don't. I mean, all journalists.
So then, why do we convey the protections for the political journalists that are aimed at this special obligation that they have on people who write about architecture?
Right, because as a practical matter, People who write about architecture or music don't end up, for example, in a position where they have confidential sources whose identity might be compelled by the government to be disclosed.
That's actually not true.
By a subpoena. I mean, I'm not saying it never happens. And there is a First Amendment value to having free and open criticism of things like music and art and film and cultural products. But even the Supreme Court has said that you can dichotomize, you can delineate. But, for example, political speech is entitled to far greater constitutional protection than commercial speech, even though it's all speech and all entitled to constitutional protection under the First Amendment. As a practical matter, political journalism plays a much more important role in terms of checking government deceit and corruption than people who write music criticism, which isn't to say that only political journalism has a value and music criticism doesn't, but in terms of the values that we're discussing, in terms of how the media serves as a watchdog over the government, obviously political journalists have a special role to play in terms of serving as a check on the political class.
I kind of feel like you are saying that political journalism is more important than all other kinds of journalism.
I am saying that.
And I guess I disagree there. I think that there are lots of kinds of journalism that are incredibly important that don't have to do with politics. I mean, is journalism that's about other countries not important? Is journalism about economics not as important? Is it less important to know?
I think economics.
About science?
I think people who write about economic policy are engaged in a form of political journalism. I think there are other types of journalism that are incredibly important. I didn't say political journalism is the only important type of journalism, but I think in terms of the values, that the role that journalism plays in our republic and how our government functions and how our society operates, people who are engaged in political journalism play a special role. And if they stop playing that role will likely be unfulfilled. And so in that regard, yeah, I do think that they have unique obligations and a unique function. And, I'll just ask
the question. So they are more important.
Yeah, I said 10 times, I do think they are more important, which is not to say that that kind of journalism is the only important kind of journalism. But I think that there is a unique and critical value to journalists who check government corruption and expose government wrongdoing that is not found in people who write theater criticism or who write about the latest albums that have been released. That's important too, but it doesn't have the same value in terms of how our government functions as political journalists do.
Well, I guess part of it is the question of whether how the government functions is sort of the most important thing for citizens to know. But I guess, but we're back down to the fact that whether or not people have this obligation, and I think as citizens you do, right? As citizens you have some sort of obligation to try to inform your fellow man. You can't if they won't read it. And I was making a positive claim about whether people will read it. And I think that it's really well supported. They don't watch it. They click away. The stuff on the web doesn't get nearly as much traffic as lifestyle stuff. It doesn't get as much traffic as lifestyle stuff about Obama. Obama's bowling stories are more likely to get traffic, or scandal stories get more traffic. People read these things. And in every venue where we are actually able to track what people read, we see the same thing.
Yeah, I think you're overstating that case, though. I mean, if you look, for example, at the cable news show that has the greatest growth over the last 2 years, it's Keith Olbermann on MSNBC, who spends the bulk of his time discussing and engaging in examinations of corruption and law-breaking at the highest levels of the Bush administration, FISA discussions, telecom, immunity. If you look on the Internet, certainly the political websites that get enormous amounts of traffic and enormous amounts of readership, growing readership, are websites that engage in this kind of political coverage that people perceive that the corporate media, the establishment press, is simply not doing any longer. And so I think it's a huge overgeneralization to say that, if you show stories about celebrity fluff or John Edwards and the beauty salon, that's going to generate attention and you can have a successful venture. Whereas if you talk about, George Bush listening in without warrant in violation of the Fourth Amendment, or the government authorizing and legalizing widespread torture methods at Guantanamo and in Iraqi prisons, that people are just going to start clicking away. I mean, there's just way too many examples that disprove that on both ends.
I mean, I would say that, anything will grow if it starts off at a very small base. You get very high growth rates for things that have very little traffic. But Drudge is growing faster than any of these things, and Drudge is all...
Well, the Huffington Post actually is too, and there's a fair amount of political coverage there. But again, now we're just back to that same issue, and I don't know how long we've been going on, but we probably should pick on like one last kind of area because I think it's been like 50 minutes. But again, we're just back to that same question, which is if you are the editor of the Washington Post, and let's say your profit can be measured on a scale of 1 to 10, and you know that by publishing nothing but stories about petty, vapid, Drudge-like trash, that your profit margin will be a 9.5. But if instead you send Dana Priest off for 6 months at great expense to try and uncover the CIA black sites that are being maintained by the Bush administration throughout Eastern Europe, where we're torturing and rendering people invisible to the international human rights system in violation of the law, or where you send Dana Priest and Ann Hull off for 6 months to investigate conditions at Walter Reed, things that people might not be as interested in, or they might be, but they might not be, then your profit margin, your profit level will be, say, a 7.5 or a 7 instead of a 9.5. Do we expect that journalism as a profession with professional obligations to the public interest will choose to uncover serious government wrongdoing even if it reduces their profit margin, not to the point of bankruptcy, but marginally? Or do we think that it's perfectly fine, and do we sanction journalists, even with their constitutional protections and their legal protections and their administrative considerations that they get, to ignore that role entirely and just turn out trashy fluff that people are going to read so they can charge the most for their advertising dollars? And I think the former is certainly a reasonable expectation to have in exchange for all the things that journalists get.
Well, I guess I'm trying to formulate a principle here by which Sports Illustrated is not morally obligated to turn itself into a political magazine that separates out what you're talking about from, if you have an obligation to pay your own money because you're a journalist, you suddenly have this or because you own a paper, you suddenly have this obligation to pay fairly large sums to provide information to other people. Why, for example, don't you have an obligation to donate a certain amount of your money to posting political ads on the same thing? Or why doesn't Sports Illustrated, because it's a publication, have an obligation to do these things? I'm not being disingenuous here, actually. I'm looking for a first principle that says that, these 5 people, and what you're really talking about is sort of 10 national dailies, right? Is it 10? Chicago, LA, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the Washington Post.
Well, then there are TV outlets too. There are TV outlets and cable news programs that get all sorts of special treatment from the government. I think if you're going to say that media companies and media outlets are no different than any other citizen, then it means that when it comes time for a Supreme Court hearing or a congressional hearing, there should be no special place reserved for journalists. They should get in line like everyone else, first come, first serve. We should do away with all shield laws. There should be no special considerations for when journalists get subpoenaed, the way the Department of Justice and every state attorney general office has. And we ought to consider repealing the First Amendment in terms of freedom of the press, because really, if all the media is no different than the supermarket down the street, and the only goal is to sell as much potatoes as possible, I just don't see why we need to give them any special protection at all. We ought to just let the government make statements without being investigated and without any watchdogs over them, and just have that be the state of affairs in which we live. And I think what happens is what you saw in 2001, 2002, and 2003, which is you have a government that runs amok with virtually no limitations of any kind because no one knows or cares what they're really doing.
Look, I guess I would say that I think we give them those privileges because we, as the rest of the citizens, think that we're better off in the same way that we let cops get away with, not paying their speeding tickets because we think that as a citizenry we're better off having cops who do, I don't think that we do these, we don't let journalists in to the Supreme Court as some sort of quid pro quo. We let journalists into the Supreme Court because we want to have journalists in the Supreme Court.
Because we expect them to write stories about what our government is doing in a way that actually sheds light on what it's doing rather than just relying on government statements. That's why we let them in.
Well, I perfectly agree with you that a journalist, once they are writing a story, has an obligation to write that story to the best of their ability. But that's not the same thing.
But why? What if they could write it in a way that's kind of misleading, but in a way that would attract more readers? Isn't that really what they ought to be doing?
No, I said that at the beginning.
But why? Where does that obligation come from?
I think it is one's obligation as a human being. I think that is just simply like a moral thing about people. You should not lie to other people for your personal profit or mislead them for your personal profit. So that's got nothing to do with my special obligations as a journalist. That's got to do with the fact that I'm a person and people should.
Okay, so how about if we give reporters in the Supreme Court special consideration? They always get to go in. There's seats reserved for them that the regular public can't get, and they go in and instead of writing about the argument or about the legal issues at stake or the monumental government interests that are being implicated, instead they churn out articles about Sandra Day O'Connor's hair and how Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas interacted and how they joked and just very kind of frivolous matters that don't shed light on
well,
anything that
we're
doing.
Administratively, we can pull the. I would say that administratively, if they aren't doing us any good, we have a perfect right to pull the passes and give them to someone else that we think will do a better job. But this is all, again, I don't think that this is an actual problem with Supreme Court journalism. And so I think, in theory, yes, we should pull their passes. But again, I don't think this is some sort of a quid pro quo. We're not giving them the passes because they're special people.
No, we're giving them the passes because we expect them to perform a function that we consider to be important to the public interest.
Right.
Right.
But
if they don't fulfill that, and if they don't fulfill that,
I see this as a mutual gain from trade. It's not like it's not like I've become a priest when I took on the role of being a journalist. It's that people give me, GE lets me into their shareholder meeting, not because I'm a journalist and I'm therefore special and I'm entitled to go wherever the hell I please. They let me in because they want me to cover their shareholder meeting. And similarly, we let journalists into the Supreme Court because we want the Supreme Court covered. And if they're not doing a good job, then we should kick them out and get different journalists.
Right. And if the media is not doing a good job in performing the functions that have a positive social interest, a positive public interest, then we ought to rescind their special privileges as well.
Okay, now we're back to a positive claim. You are making a positive claim that the media can somehow change what people read, and I'm disputing that claim.
Well, no,
so back to, I don't think that people have an obligation to write stories no one reads.
Right, but if no one had read the Watergate stories that Bernstein and Woodward wrote, it still would have had an enormous impact because evidence of it would have actually because evidence of government crimes were uncovered, and then prosecutors could have prosecuted the people who were responsible for those crimes, and so uncovering government deceit and corruption has significant value, even if it's not getting huge ratings.
Okay, but two things. First of all, we're not arguing about whether the John Yoo story was spiked. It ran. It ran in every major national daily. It ran on the television shows. It ran everywhere. What we're arguing about is how much it should have run. Okay, so in some sense, this is about how many people read it. It's not about whether they ran the coverage or not. They did run the coverage. So the question is, should they have just kept... First of all, I actually dispute that they didn't do the coverage. I think that your Nexus search was flawed.
You think there was a good substantial discussion about the fact that memorandum referenced the fact that the Fourth Amendment didn't apply domestically inside the United States to domestic military operations? You think that was aired, that was discussed, the significance and the radicalism of that was noted, that there was substantial coverage of that would have informed the average American watching as to what the ramifications of that event was?
How many stories have you written for major magazines?
Well, can you answer what?
No. I'm actually asking because I'm going to make a point about this. I'm sort of
it
curious.
Depends what you consider major magazines.
Well, have you done a lot of sort of hard news reporting rather than opinion stuff, rather than magazine pieces?
I think a lot of stuff I did before on my blog and that I do now is hard
not
reporting.
blogging.
I'm not sure.
Blogging is completely different. We're talking about running in a print daily.
For a newspaper? Have I worked as a newspaper reporter? Is that what your question?
Something that's basically sort of like sort of not opinion journalism, not magazine, not like Atlantic journalism, New Republic, etc., but just sort of straight news reporting.
I don't recognize the distinction you're drawing, but I've been writing politically for 2 years. First on my blog and now at Salon. I've written in other magazines. But I think if I told you what they were, you would say, well, that's not the kind of straight reporting I'm talking about. I do interviews of political figures. I try and uncover things that government officials are hiding. So I consider that straight reporting. I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, I think that there's a sort of shock when you get out of blogging into journalism and start doing magazine pieces. First of all, because either sort of when you start doing news pieces, and the first shock is like, oh my God, I've got 700 words, and that's all I have for the story. And the second shock is that when you get bogged down in sort of explanations of things that require sort of 600 words to explain why this thing is important, that gets cut because there's not space for it.
Right. That's just that's because those media outlets are not devoted to real reporting. I mean, but if you write an article for the New Yorker, like Seymour Hersh does, or for the Atlantic, there are plenty of stories that are much longer than 700 words.
Right. But you're talking about 2 magazines in the entire country that run at that length.
And obviously online journals.
Right, but we're not talking about online now. We're talking about television and print, right? That's what you did a Nexus search on, is print.
No, Nexus includes transcripts for television. Nexus included my blog, so a lot of those UN torture and UN Fourth Amendment results were actually from my blog. It includes everything, the whole universe.
Well, I'm looking at the newspaper results. I got about 100 for a newspaper. It's just, it's unfortunate in the sense that, like, having constrained space is really difficult, and I hate it. And I hate the fact that when I wrote for The Economist, when I've written for, print dailies, that stuff that I think is really important and interesting gets cut simply because just explaining why this matters takes too much space. And stuff like that is going to get cut out of, stuff like the Fourth Amendment stuff is going to get cut out of the U story because most Americans don't know what the Fourth... again, sad history classes is in a terrible state. Most Americans don't know what the Fourth Amendment says. And so when you get down to it, you then have to explain why this was a special transgression against it. That stuff gets cut out of the heart of print stories because they have to sell an ad page to support every single page that goes in, which means they just don't have that much space.
I guess I would say 2 things. One is that I disagree with you that Americans are too ignorant to understand the importance of that story. You say the Constitution doesn't allow the government to break into your house and break down your door or listen to your phone conversation without a warrant, and yet the Bush administration, in secret, concluded that doesn't apply to them, that they're free to violate that whenever they want inside the United States. I think most people would understand that, and I just explained it in 8 seconds. And secondly, I think that if the media...
But you couldn't write that in a magazine. That would never fly. I would never get that past an editor.
I would write it a little bit longer. I think I used 12 words just then. I'm saying if I were on television.
You used about 150.
No,
we can count when
the playback happens. But I would say the second thing is that if the government of the United States is going to suspend the Fourth Amendment in secret, and the political press in this country isn't really going to mention that, except in the briefest sort of side references in passing, then that's as strong of an indictment of the political press as anything that I could possibly say. If the political press isn't going to cover that,
but they did.
I don't see what it's I just don't agree. Did the media? Pravda used to mention, when high Kremlin officials were convicted of crimes, they would mention it in passing, on some back page to say that they were able to cover it. Obviously, if you put something, in a 2-second clip on CNN in between 12 other segments, that's not exactly covering the story.
But the Washington Post ran 12 stories on this one story in a month.
On the suspension of the Fourth Amendment.
On the U memos.
Right, I'm talking about the suspension of the Fourth Amendment inside the United States. I'm talking about that. I can guarantee you that the number of Americans who know that the Bush administration ruled the Fourth Amendment inapplicable inside the United States is probably 1/50th, if not worse, than the number who know that Barack Obama can't bowl. And I don't know, for me those facts just speak for themselves in terms of how horrendous the political media is in this country, but you seem to think that that's okay because for some reason people are more interested in Barack Obama's bowling score than in the suspension of the Constitution. I don't think it's true, and I think even if it is true, there's still a special obligation on the part of the political press to cover the suspension of the Bill of Rights.
I would argue that much to my sadness, Americans don't care about torture very much, and I think that that's terribly sad.
Then why does everybody go out of their way? Why does everybody go out of their way to insist that we don't torture?
For the same reason that we go out of our way, to insist that we do lots of things that aren't nice. Like, why do politicians say that the government only does good things? Are we asking that question, really?
No, I mean, I'm saying if people don't really care if the government is torturing, why
people don't want to know? Okay, why do we make jokes about prison rape? We don't want to know what happens in our prisons. We don't want to know.
I agree with that.
But we know that the bad things kind of happen, but most Americans don't care about prison rape. And I also think that is a travesty and terrible. But the fact is, I could run a zillion stories about prison rape, and you know what? Most Americans still wouldn't care.
Yeah,
and they wouldn't read the stories.
But if your stories led to the removal of wardens who sanctioned prison rape, then your stories would have a very significant palliative impact on this problem, regardless of how many Americans cared.
Right, but if I had a paper and all I ran
that's what
was
investigative
stories,
journalism is.
But if I had a paper and all I ran was stories about prison rape, I soon wouldn't have a paper to say anything.
You could run other things. I mean, you could run it. That's what I said. I don't think anyone expects media outlets to only cover stories that would result in their bankruptcy. The question is whether they have obligations beyond just profit maximization that would perhaps diminish their profits in a way that a lawyer diminishes his or her profits by advising a client not to pursue frivolous lawsuits, or a doctor diminishes his or her profits by advising patients not to obtain unnecessary surgeries. You don't do that to the point of bankruptcy.
Well, let's go back to television, because I actually think that television really is the core here. Television stories that aren't photogenic, like you can't do you on television. And you and I have been on Talking Head shows, and we both know how low the quality of debate is on these shows, right? Like I get 30 seconds to explain the Federal Reserve, and you get 20 seconds to explain the Fourth Amendment, and you maybe spend 5 minutes debating. And in fact, that's not because the television people are evil. That really is like sort of the format that they can make work. Things like the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour don't get good ratings. Things like Firing Line could never be done today. It's just those formats are done for a reason the way that they are, and it has to do with sort of video attention spans. And I think that that's awful. I mean, I think that that's not good for society, that we're so driven by TV, and that TV is such a shallow medium. But I think it's a structural problem about television, and I think that, honestly, TV is one of those things where the switching cost is so low that they really do, they're at their limit on the news stories. They're at their limit on all of this stuff because people will switch as soon as they get bored. And what you get down to is that the print media ends up driven by these stories like things about Barack Obama's bowling and so forth. But honestly, I think, first of all, you do have to remember that most of those stories were squibs. They weren't actual stories. They didn't occupy any serious mental space for anyone. You're talking about it.
Well, no, they get reported. They get reported, and they end up being featured in opinion commentary and all kinds of op-ed columns. I mean, they just permeate the news narrative.
I think that that's true. But I diagnose this as a structural problem with the way that. But I actually think that I'm going to defend the American public a little bit here. Which is, first of all, I think that for you and me, the you story is complicated. And you can tell it in one way because you don't have anyone here arguing with you. But to actually, sort of step through that whole thing is incredibly complicated. And most people just don't want complicated when they get home. They're really tired and they've been out all day. And I think that that's true. I think that, people don't want to sit through a college lecture on constitutional law. And I actually think that that's the important way to cover the story. The important way to cover the story is not to grab the soundbite you just gave me. It's to actually walk through the whole thing and walk through the Fourth Amendment and exactly what happened. And you can't do that on television. People don't want it. But I also think that, going forward, John Yoo doesn't matter to me in the end. What matters is Bush. What matters is who did we put in place.
Right. John Yoo was Bush's instrument. He was the person who acted on Bush's behalf. That's all John Yoo is.
But what I think is that, people, we can't do anything about it. And I actually think, as one of my friends emailed me this morning, really the hopeful thing is that all three presidential candidates have come out against torture. So one way or the other, this is going to be a non-issue in 2009 and not a moment too soon.
Dick Cheney says that he's against torture as well. Very few people actually come out and advocate torture and say they're in favor of it.
Which of the three presidential candidates do you think is going to make this policy?
Well, I think that when you start wars and you occupy other countries and you face a population that doesn't want you there, like when you occupy Iraq for a long period of time, inevitably you're going to find yourself doing brutal and savage things. All occupiers do. And so this is part of the disagreement that we were having earlier, but when you cheer on invasions of other countries that haven't attacked you and want to occupy other countries as a means to advance your policy goals, the way, say, John McCain does, those things are inevitable byproducts of those policies. Even if you, when asked, say that you think torture is a really bad and mean thing to do, it still ends up, foreseeably, being something that's going to happen. So the fact that all three presidential candidates check off the no box on the torture question doesn't really resolve this issue, I don't think.
Okay, this is a little complicated because you've just started bundling a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't really have much to do with you. The Iraq War and you are completely separate things. His memo came out right before, I believe, on the day that we invaded Iraq. And it didn't, as far as I know, have very much to do with Iraq. It was about stuff happening in Guantanamo and within the U.S., correct?
Actually, what happened was that memorandum was the memorandum that was used to brief the general, Jeffrey Miller, who was the commander of Abu Ghraib, of Guantanamo. And he then took that memorandum that said that interrogators can be immunized from criminal prosecution even if they torture. Here's what torture means. It means anything short of organ failure. And he went to Iraq and trained the Iraqi commanders of prisoners, the U.S. commanders of Iraqi prisoners, including Abu Ghraib. It created the whole framework of how we treated detainees and treated people who were being interrogated, not just in
What I'm
Guantanamo,
saying
but
is
in
that
Iraq
these
as
two
well.
things they weren't connected causally.
I just
They're
explained the causal
completely-
connection, which is that the
The
framework...
U-memos did not cause the Iraq War. The Iraq War did not cause the U-memos.
No, the U-memos did not cause the Iraq War. The U-memos caused the treatment
So
of
having
detainees
supported
in
the
Iraq.
war has nothing to do with you. Having
Well,
supported it's two completely separate
No,
things.
now, it's not.
You can say
It's not.
that, like...
It's not. And I mean, if you can think that, but I mean, that was the argument that the German war criminals made at Nuremberg, which was we didn't have any role to play specifically in this atrocity or in this atrocity. We didn't know about this concentration camp or about this particular form of abuse of the laws of war. But the tribunal said you're nonetheless guilty for those things because you participated in the kingpin of war crimes, which is aggressive war. And you know that if you wage aggressive war, those things are likely to happen. You become a party to those things, a collaborator in them, by essentially signing on to the first war crime, which is the invasion of Iraq, which is aggressive war. So you can...
But no one was signing on to the U-memos when they signed on to that because the U-memos didn't exist. Okay,
well,
when
existed.
People supported the invasion of the war, the U-memos hadn't happened.
No, that's not true. There was one in mid-2002, the Bybee memo, that John Yoo wrote, that it was the first memo
that
to
no
redefine
one knew
torture.
About. Yes?
Right, but people know, I assume, that aggressive wars in the past have led to war crimes. They tend to be connected. Even though, without having read John Yoo's memo, you could know that you could read the Nuremberg trial judgment, and which serve as the foundation for Western morality in terms of foreign affairs, and know that was the center.
I would sort of strongly disagree on that. I mean, I think that the Nuremberg trials did the right thing in some sense, but it was also they weren't trials. The results were decided before a defendant entered the courtroom. So, like, in some sense, I don't think of that as a good example of the rule of law. It wasn't the rule of law. It was killing people that we decided needed killing, and I think we were right; they needed killing. But I mean, well, not killing.
So you don't believe in the principles of the Nuremberg trial?
I believe in the rule of law. Actually.
Do you believe in the principles of the Nuremberg principles?
I do not think that you should walk into a courtroom when there is literally no way that you could ever be acquitted. I think if you're going to do that, if you know you're going to shoot Himmler, you shouldn't try him. You should just shoot him. Because I think the law is so important that to ever undermine that to use the law to paint something that we're doing up in this, that it fundamentally isn't. The law is about I go into a jury of my peers and they decide whether I'm guilty or innocent. And that there was no process. We used the process to cover up what we were fundamentally doing.
How about the
killing people we already decided were guilty?
How about the people detained at Guantanamo and in Iraq, the tens of thousands detained by the Bush administration with no trial, not even a show trial? How do you feel about that?
I'm against it.
And
I think that they should have whatever the protocol. I'm not an expert in military law, but my understanding is that there are provisions in military law for dealing with POWs that have to do with sort of military tribunals to decide what their fate should be. I don't know what you do about POWs with a government that kind of doesn't exist but is still fighting us.
And with the war that goes on forever.
Yeah, what do you do with POWs in that situation? I don't know.
POWs are people who are picked up on the battlefield. These are people who are picked up from their homes on the street while at work. These are not people who have, some of them are, but huge numbers of people in Iraq and Guantanamo are not people who are picked up on the battlefield.
Glenn, I mean, like, I'm in no way any expert on these things, so I don't want to sort of make too strong a comment, but I think you've confused me with someone else. I'm not in favor of these things. I never have been.
Oh no, because I was talking about. I was just asking you what your opinion was on that, and then
I don't know the particulars enough to deliver. I mean, like, I supported the Iraq War, and I was wrong, and at that point, I got out of the foreign policy business and stuck to what I know.
Until this week.
No, actually, because what I was writing about was the media business. I wasn't writing about foreign policy or the justice of the U memos or anything else. I don't have anything to offer on that. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know enough about the law to offer any sort of opinion. I mean, I'm willing to take your word that the memos are crap, et cetera, but for me, this wasn't a question about John Yoo. It was a question about something that I do know about, which is the media business and being a journalist.
All right.
So this is not about U.S. foreign policy. I'm not arguing with you about U.S. foreign policy. I don't really have. I don't think that I'm qualified to have an opinion on U.S. foreign policy. Is what it comes down to. But sort of my libertarian instincts are, that you shouldn't hold people without trial. You shouldn't. This is sort of basic stuff that I don't. And I actually think that this has been a problem. Is that you've confused factual disagreements with you with disagreements about principle. And I can factually disagree about what the media is doing and why it's doing it, and even what the obligations of the media are, without liking what the government is doing or wanting the government not to get coverage of this or in some other way. I guess what I would say is that I think that covering the government and watching the bastards as closely as possible is one of the highest callings that a person can have, and it's an incredibly good thing to do. It's like a mitzvah. But I don't think it's an obligation. And I think, of anyone, of any citizen, or I don't think it's a special obligation of journalists as apart from their duties as citizens. And I think that we all have duties as citizens that we aren't fulfilling very well. But I guess, what it comes down to is that I'm not arguing with you about whether U.S. foreign policy is great. The Iraq War was a disastrous mistake, and it has resulted in a huge number of dead civilians, and it has resulted in things like Abu Ghraib that are just, unbelievable stains on the national honor, and I called for Don Rumsfeld to resign when it happened. I think that these are, I don't want to even say tragedies, because tragedy somehow implies that, they weren't controllable. They're appalling. They're abominations that Americans did these things to Iraqis.
Right. We obviously agree on all that, and I think you said that, eloquently and authentically, and I couldn't agree more with all the sentiments you just expressed. For me, the one thing that I would add, and I think this is the source of our disagreement, which I think is a reasonable one, is that I think the media played a substantial role in all of the things that you just described, both in terms of just malfeasance and affirmatively helping the Bush administration to do those things, all the things that you just identified quite well. And I think that until that changes, those things are likely to repeat themselves in the future. And I don't know what the answer is, because I'm not someone who thinks that enacting laws to compel people to do things that they ought to be doing but they're not doing is a good idea, or even something that can work. But I do think that pointing out that the media is essentially engaging in a sort of fraud, because they don't really describe themselves the way that you describe them. They don't come out and say, we just put whatever crap on TV people are going to watch and put on frivolous stuff because people don't want to hear heavy things. They depict themselves as these watchdogs, as these serious political journalists, and I think that they don't fulfill that function, and because they don't, our country is suffering in a lot of ways, and it's a very serious problem, regardless of what the causes are, regardless of what the potential solutions might be. Anyway, we've gone on for an hour and 15 minutes, I hope, because it was interesting. You're the Blogging Heads regular. Are we over our time?
Yeah, it's certainly lively. I do want to finish up by saying one thing, which is that I think that part of the disagreement here, aside from the positive stuff about sort of whether this even can be done, is that I'm being a libertarian, I'm really cautious about talking about obligations. And so I can think that something is a really, really good thing that people, it would be really, really good if people did. And I think it's really, really good that you and a ton of other bloggers are out there pounding on the administration about all sorts of civil rights things, right? I think that that's great. But I'm really uncomfortable telling other people that they have a moral obligation to do anything, unless it's sort of like a fundamental negative right. I'm always just extremely leery of assigning positive obligations to anyone, and that comes down to journalists and everyone else. So I think it's not that I don't think that it would be good if more people knew about the U story. I'm just skeptical, A, of journalists' ability to do it, and B, also reluctant to say that they have to. I can say it would be good if they would, but I'm very reluctant to tell other people how they have to live their lives and what their moral obligations are.
Right, I understand that. I mean, ultimately, though, unless we're talking about things like the Fairness Doctrine or, laws that would regulate media behavior, which I haven't suggested or advocated in our exchange or as part of this conversation, unless we're talking about things like that, whether it's an obligation that they're failing to fulfill, or just that the fact that their behavior is incredibly destructive and shameful and lowly, is almost really a semantic question. I mean, to me, the issue is not so much do they have some binding obligation in the sense that you're required to pay your taxes or drive under a certain speed limit in various places. The question is what they're doing what they claim they're doing, what they ought to be doing, and what is something that is harming the country, in an extremely profound way. And to me, that's really the important question, whether you want to call it an obligation or just a function that I think the founders expected that they would fulfill and that our government and society require them to fulfill or need them to fulfill, I think is really just a semantic distinction.
Well, I think, too, though, that I'm much less willing to assign bad agency to people than you are. I mean, like, was what Judy Miller did wrong? Like, in some moral agent sense, or was it just incompetent?
What do you think?
And I generally assume it was incompetent. I think that I never assign to sort of bad motives what I can assign to people doing a bad job or just having a bad day. I mean, people get taken in.
Judy Miller had a bad day?
No. I think that what she did was, I think that what happened to her was sort of the right thing. But I don't need to believe that Judy Miller was a terrible person who is some sort of, like, pernicious influence on America. I can just believe that, like, stuff got screwed up. And I think that the thing that's always easy from the outside and always easy in hindsight is to say, well, you should have known X, Y, and Z. And I look back at, say, reporting of the Enron scandal and how bad almost all of it was. Was this because people were bad reporters or just that, like, very complicated stories that rely heavily on anonymous sourcing ultimately require you to sort of pick some people and put your trust in them, and Judith Miller picked the wrong people to put her trust in, and she was then extremely slow to untrust them, I guess. But I mean, this is the sort of thing that I guess we don't really have time to go into, but I just think that, like, I think I'm kinder to people who make errors than you are, possibly because I've made some of my own, but just in general on most things, I think that, people do make mistakes, and doctors and lawyers, and they all make terrible mistakes, and people die because of their mistakes. But it doesn't necessarily make them a bad person, and it doesn't necessarily point to a problem with the system. It can just be that someone made a terrible, terrible, terrible mistake that had horrifying outcomes.
Right. That clearly, in principle, you're right. Or it could be that people have bad motives. A lot of times, people who are in power and who are in the political elite of powerful countries that do bad things really have had bad motives. And other times, they've just been inept. So, in principle, I don't disagree with you.
I just can't. I have no window into man's souls. So I think we'd better wrap this up before our readers fall asleep and we stop informing them. But it's been lovely talking to you, and I hope Miami clears up soon.
Thank you, Megan. Have a good time in Pasadena.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.